Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown. Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery is one of the most haunted places in London. In the early 1800s, the city's population topped the 1 million mark, and there was such a high death rate, and it was continuously growing. The graves were crammed between taverns and shops, and the undertakers dressed up as clergymen to perform illegal ceremonies. So many people were actually buried in shallow graves, and these were quickly covered with lime. So they weren't properly buried, and so therefore the smell and the disease were just horrifying. So it was at that point when things became so bad that the local government, Parliament, decided that 7 private cemeteries would be built in the countryside around London. These were actually known as the Magnificent Seven. There was a third cemetery, and that was dated in 1839, and it was Highgate. The architect, who was also the builder, turned Highgate into an eternal oasis of peace and a kind of natural paradise. Everyone who was anybody wanted to be buried there. There were so many rich and famous people buried there. And even to this day, in more modern times, numerous rock stars and celebrities have also been buried there. And Karl Marx was buried there. And by 1854, the place was completely packed anyway, so going back to the 1800s. And they bought another 20 adjoining acres. And then by the turn of the 20th century, the cemetery's fortunes began to, go down. So then World War One decimated the staff, and by the end of World War Two, the cemetery had pretty much been abandoned. In the 1960s, the gates to Highgate Cemetery were then closed, and the landscape just kind of became, wild and turned into a bit of a jungle. And some of the buildings started to collapse and crumble in on themselves. The studios used the grounds to shoot horror movies because it was just so neglected, and it became such a scary place. There were a number of stories of men dressed in dark robes practicing black magic rituals there, and people seeing ghosts and ghouls and haunting the alleyways around the graveyard. Many people reported seeing red eyed demonic beings staring at them through the fence. And so, it just became a very, very frightening, sinister place. And then there was a story of what later became known as the Highgate vampire. This vampire, this apparition, was said to be a medieval nobleman who practiced black magic in Romania. His coffin was brought from Europe to England in the 18th century, and he had a cult following back in Romania. And so they came with the body, and they brought him to a house in the West End of London. He was buried at the site that eventually became Highgate Cemetery. So it sounds like he was actually buried there before, when it was, some other burial site. Anyway, he apparently slept peacefully until the Satanists performed some kind of ritual at the cemetery, which, woke him up. And I don't know, they must have probably already known about him. Perhaps they were his followers. I'm not sure. Nobody seems to know that much about it. So then this Highgate vampire is described as being tall, very tall, maybe about 8 foot tall, a dark figure, dressed in black, I believe, and he sort of glides through the cemetery. His presence is frequently announced by a sudden drop in temperature, And he has also caused, watches to stop and, electronics to malfunction when he's close by. He terrifies animals who go anywhere near the area. And there have been countless dead foxes that have been found on the cemetery grounds, which have been blamed, to him. Anyway, this vampire has a hypnotic stare, and it has a bone-chilling effect on all the people who have encountered him, especially those who have been, insane enough to spend the night at this cemetery. And I don't think you can do that anymore, but back then people would actually go in there, they'd, go in through the gates and or climb over the wall, and they would just sleep in there, hoping to see something. The Highgate vampire is really just one of the beings in Highgate Cemetery, one of the apparitions. The problems with the dead started during Victorian times with coffins that were actually exploding. Highgate Cemetery had a series of tombs built for those who wanted to be buried above ground. And the regulations at the time required that the tombs be encased in lead to prevent miasma leaking out. As the bodies decomposed in their sealed tombs, there would be a buildup of gases, and this would cause the coffins to explode. So they found a solution, and that was to drill a small hole in the coffin, place a pipe in it, and then light a match so that the gases could burn off hygienically, as it was called. Though the cemetery is done burning off gases, there are still problems, including things that are heard, like banshee wails that, can't be associated with bodies, the gases in bodies and things like that. And there are spectral faces that float around the place. So there are many ghosts, including a cyclist that wanders around the grounds and the floating ghost of a nun. And, there are just so many spirits that people are seeing. Um, and there are actually about 170,000 people buried at Highgate Cemetery. And there are 53,000 graves on 37 acres. There are still plots for sale, uh, and it still continues to be quite a popular place for occult enthusiasts hoping to see the vampire. One of the haunted places is a road, just a sort of small road known as Swains Lane, that kind of goes around the cemetery area or goes past it. And it's quite, there are a lot of trees around the area, so that can still seem a little bit spooky walking down there. But there have been numerous sightings of apparitions and things inside the cemetery when people have been walking along that road next to the cemetery at night, especially. So, Highgate Cemetery is actually located west of Swains Lane, and there was a former estate on there called Ashurst Estate. So, it kind of makes you wonder what they were doing. That the place later became, a cemetery, and there were all these apparitions and things. So, I don't know. Perhaps they were into black magic or something, which was not that uncommon in some of those old estates, some of those upper class families. So anyway, the main gate of the estate is actually still can still be seen there at the cemetery. The rights of burial were sold for either a limited period or in perpetuity. So anyway, soon Highgate Cemetery became a really fashionable place to bury a loved one, especially if you had money. The Victorian attitude towards death and was kind of interesting because they loved to create beautiful Gothic tombs and buildings. It was it was kind of big business in a way. So they would do things like buildings which would look Egyptian and, just kind of romantic kind of stuff like that, historically inspired buildings and things like that. Um, there's, for example, the in the Egyptian Avenue. there's an impressive structure which consists of 16 vaults, and each of them contain 12 coffins on each side. And it's entered through a massive arch on one of them. And just about as impressive is another one, which is called the Circle of Lebanon. And this circle, and this is kind of an interesting story, this circle was created using the earth which belonged to an ancient cedar of Lebanon tree that stood in the garden of the former Ashurst estate. And this circle consists of 36 vaults. And then there's also the terrace catacombs. And these catacombs have quite an impressive frontage, and there's room there for about 825 bodies in 55 vaults, with rooms for 15 coffins each. So, there are these beautiful large buildings that are beautifully decorated graves, at this cemetery. And, everything was just kind of I don't know, architectural work of art, I guess. So, about 20 years after the opening of the cemetery, there were actually enough funds to extend the area by buying a large section on the east side of Swains Lane. So this side is now just referred to as the east. There's actually a tunnel that's beneath Swains Lane that connects the new cemetery with the older West Cemetery. So, anyways, I mentioned before, after the cemetery lost its funds and was left for quite some time until it became overgrown and stuff, some of the movie industry people got really interested in it for filming, horror movies, gothic horror movies. And one of those studios was Movie Studio Hammer, which used the abandoned site for filming their horror movies. Anyway, people started to send in stories about their own experiences with creepy things that happened to them around the graveyard, the cemetery area, and around the Swains Lane especially. And, a lot of stories go back way, way, right when the cemetery was built, and also and also stories from that actual land before the cemetery was built. Things were already happening. There are numerous stories about the vampire, but there are also other entities that have been seen. For example, there was a man who was attacked by a creature that came out of the cemetery wall as he walked by one evening. And then the creature dissolved when a car drove by, blinding it with its headlights. One of the ghosts that has been seen there is of a mad old woman with very long gray hair that's kind of blowing around behind her. And she's racing among the graves looking for her children. And apparently, people say that she murdered them in a fit of rage. And so this ghost of a woman in white just kind of runs around, trying to look for her children. In 1969, a man called David Ferrant claimed that he saw a grey figure while he was passing the cemetery. He became convinced that this was the Highgate vampire. So his story was circulated among the other people who were interested in the occult. I believe they were magicians. They called themselves magicians, I think. And at that time, there was also a rival magician called Sean Manchester, who claimed that he could single-handedly put a stop to the vampire. So this rivalry between the two men just got, bigger and bigger, and it actually became news at the time. And then on Friday in 1970, March 13th, Sean Manchester decided to have a massive vampire hunt. So many people answered his call and they joined in. Police tried to stop it, of course, but then they ended up just trying to control the mob. They swarmed all over the gates and walls into the locked cemetery. The grave of the vampire wasn't actually found, but the men didn't actually give up either. So sometime later, on August 1st, 1970, The charred and headless remains of a woman's body were found not far from the catacombs. A few nights later, David Ferrant was found by the police in the churchyard beside Highgate Cemetery, and he was carrying a wooden stake and a crucifix. He ended up being arrested, but when his case came to court, they let him go. Rumors began to spread that Manchester and David Ferrant would meet in what was called the Magician's Duel, and this would take place on Parliament Hill, Friday the 13th, April 1973. This actually never occurred. Later on, in 1974, Ferrant was actually jailed again for damaging memorials and interfering with dead remains in Highgate Cemetery. He actually claimed that this was caused by Satanists and that he had nothing to do with that. Anyway, the feud between Manchester and Ferrant just went on for decades until Ferrant's death in April 2019. And the riddle of the vampire was never actually solved because they never found his grave.